The Western Front, late autumn, 1944. An overcast sky, heavy and bruised, hangs over the deep forests of the Ardennes, miles from the frantic rush of Patton's armies. The altitude is 25,000 feet. The year is drawing to its brutal close, yet here, in this frozen pocket, there is a deceptive calm, a silence soon to be shattered by an event no one could have predicted, an event that begins with a single meticulous eye. Flying a solitary mission is Flight Lieutenant Alistair Vance, a man whose reputation within the RAF's Photographic Reconnaissance Unit was built not on flamboyance, but on sheer, almost pathological, attention to detail. His aircraft, a specially modified Spitfire PR-19, was not armed with a single machine gun, but rather with a sophisticated battery of cameras designed to expose the Nazi machine in all its terrible complexity. Vance was a surveyor of shadows, a cartographer of war's grim geometry. To him, the war was a series of lines, angles, and displacements, a technical problem to be solved from the cold safety of the stratosphere. He preferred it that way. The deep, continuous drone of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was the only sound in his world, a world of freezing plexiglass and oxygen deprivation. Below, the ground was a patchwork of ochre and dark green, crisscrossed by the slender, venomous threads of roads. His mission was routine: photograph railheads and suspected fuel depots east of the German border. The tactical importance was low, the weather was terrible. The risks were inherent. Then, the anomaly appeared. On a seldom-used secondary road, partially obscured by the tree line, Vance's high-powered lenses caught a fleeting glimpse of a small, fast-moving motorcade. 3 vehicles, a Kübelwagen, a heavily curtained Opel staff car, and a drab, canvas-covered lorry, moving with a desperate, hurried purpose. They were traveling west, which was strange. Axis traffic was overwhelmingly flowing east, away from the advancing Allies. This was the first historical irony of the day. The crucial detail often hides in what is not expected, in the exception to the rule. A mere second later, the motorcade abruptly stopped, wheels kicking up gravel in a spray of dirt. Vance's aircraft, moving at nearly 400 miles per hour, offered only a blink of observation time. He watched, through the blur of speed and distance, as figures spilled out of the staff car. They were German officers, sharp-edged in their greatcoats. And then, he saw it. From the back of the curtained Opel, a figure emerged, or rather, was pushed. The movement was clumsy, unresisting. It was a woman. Her clothes were nondescript, but her posture was unmistakable. As the German guards roughly handled her near the rear of the vehicle, she collapsed, not falling naturally, but sinking in a way that suggested exhaustion, injury, or deliberate refusal to move. The Germans immediately scrambled to get her back into the car. The whole incident lasted less than 15 seconds before the convoy roared back to life and vanished into the next stretch of forest. To any other pilot, on a mission focused on concrete and steel, this was nothing. A fleeting moment of brutality, an insignificant footnote in a conflict consuming millions. But Alistair Vance, the quiet, technical pilot, felt a profound disturbance. The sight of her collapse, the swift, almost panicked reaction of the guards, it did not fit the pattern of a captured civilian or a standard military prisoner. There was a secrecy, a palpable tension in that brief roadside halt that suggested a high-value transaction or a desperate crisis. Vance was no strategist, but he was a master of reading photographic evidence. He instinctively knew that a single misplaced shadow on a reconnaissance plate could signify a bunker or a V-weapon site. This human shadow, this falling figure, felt just as significant. What they did not know below, Vance would later reflect in a confidential memo, was that the cold logic of an unarmed reconnaissance pilot had been interrupted by a single, impossible moment of human connection. He banked the Spitfire, violating his flight plan for a crucial second, adjusting his camera array. The lenses, usually pointing straight down to capture the grid of the continent, were now angled horizontally, attempting to snatch a clear image of the retreating motorcade. He pushed the film forward, sacrificing the perfect coverage of his assigned targets for this one, singular, inexplicable anomaly. The cost of this impromptu decision was massive. If he was wrong, he had wasted critical resources and risked his plane for sentimentality, a vice an officer in his position could not afford. But if he was right, if that woman was not just a prisoner, but a piece of the strategic puzzle that was currently unfolding in the murky heart of Europe, the implications were terrifying. He returned to base at 800 miles per hour, a tiny metal vessel hurtling across the dark North Sea, carrying not just rolls of film, but a secret, a profound doubt, and a moral conviction that would soon force the quietest man on the base to become the loudest voice in the war room. The clock was ticking, and the fate of the next major offensive might just depend on what a handful of German guards did during a 15-second stop on an anonymous forest road. The adventure had begun, not with a bang, but with a silent, desperate fall. The debriefing room at RAF Benson smelled of ozone, burnt coffee, and the unique acrid scent of photographic chemicals. It was here, in the cold, windowless sanctum of the Intelligence Corps, that the war was first revealed in stark black and white. Flight Lieutenant Vance delivered his film to the technicians, his report measured, clinical, and devoid of the emotional urgency he felt. He spoke only of the motorcade's unexpected direction and the unusual passenger transfer he had observed. The intelligence officer, a pragmatic squadron leader named Miles, viewed Vance with the quiet exasperation reserved for pilots who strayed from the objective. Miles's war was one of quantitative analysis. He dealt in the certainty of railway gauges and factory roof damage. A motorcade was insignificant. A vague human movement was worthless. Vance, Miles sighed, gesturing to the freshly processed prints, crisp and detailed, showing the intended targets. Your coverage of the marshalling yards is, as always, impeccable. The fuel dump is exactly where we suspected. But this business about an unscheduled stop on an unknown track, you risked losing the entire roll for this? Vance remained standing stiffly, a man seemingly carved from ice. His resolve, however, was volcanic. He pointed to a slightly blurred frame, the one he had angled for, the shot that showed the three vehicles pulling away. Sir, the nature of their stop was too sudden, too concealed, and the passenger was handled, not escorted. I am confident this was a matter of extreme importance, beyond the scope of a routine transfer, and that passenger was female. The statement hung in the air, greeted with near derision. The war in Europe was a masculine affair of mud, steel, and high explosives. The presence of a high-value female prisoner in the heart of the operational zone was almost unthinkable, unless she was a local resistor or an enemy agent of low consequence. It's a civilian, Vance, Miles stated, closing the file. A farmhand, a nurse. We deal with strategic targets, not roadside dramas. But Vance refused to yield. This was the first stage of the arc of transformation. The methodical, quiet technician was challenging the rigid structure of command, solely based on an instinct. He was not arguing a point of strategy, but a point of photographic truth. Sir, I have isolated the still from the continuous strip. The posture of the guards, the immediate resumption of speed, the level of priority afforded to their security, it suggests a high-ranking asset, or more likely, someone with critical, time-sensitive knowledge. Miles relented only slightly, assigning the print to a junior analyst named Petty for low-priority human interest identification. Petty, a young woman fresh out of university, specialized in pattern recognition of human clothing and posture from aerial shots, a nascent field of intelligence. This was the second irony. The fate of the prisoner lay with the only mind capable of seeing past the uniforms and the hardware. Over the next 24 hours, while the High Command debated the timing of the next push into the Rhineland, Vance and Petty worked in an unofficial, desperate tandem. Petty enhanced the grainy, distant image of the figure on the ground. The technological core of the mystery lay here, in the meticulous work of photo interpretation. They cross-referenced the vague uniform of the guards, not regular Wehrmacht, but a unit with the high collar and particular insignia of the Geheimfeldpolizei, the secret field police, often used for counterintelligence and the transfer of sensitive prisoners. This was the first concrete detail that shifted the narrative from roadside drama to strategic threat. Meanwhile, Vance used the coordinates of the incident to search older reconnaissance photos. He discovered the motorcade's likely point of origin, a small, isolated hunting lodge used by the German High Command near the Belgian border, a known hub for the interrogation of high-profile Allied operatives. "It all connects, sir," Petty finally reported to Vance, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. She slid a new composite print across the table. By comparing the figure's shadow, gait, and even the type of boots, Petty managed to connect the prisoner to a file that had gone cold weeks ago. Agent Kestrel. Agent Kestrel was the code name for Elara Dubois, a Franco-British Special Operations Executive, SOE operative. She had been tasked with penetrating a German signals unit in occupied territory. Her capture was known, but her fate had been a blank page. The terrible detail was that Elara had been privy to the Allied pre-invasion plans and, more terrifyingly, had been coordinating with a resistance cell that had uncovered the early movements for a major German counteroffensive, the exact scale and timing of which was unknown to the Allies. The irony was now complete. The quiet pilot, looking for fuel depots, had inadvertently discovered the key to the entire strategic balance of the upcoming winter campaign. The falling figure was not a tragic footnote. She was a live wire carrying explosive intelligence. Alistair Vance, the man who wanted to stay above the fray, was now forced to plunge into the very heart of it. He had a name, a location, and a chilling hypothesis. The German convoy was not moving Kestrel for interrogation, but for elimination before the planned offensive began. The window of opportunity to extract the intelligence she held was closing fast. Vance stood up, gathering the prints. "It's time, Petty," he said, his voice flat but resolute. "Time to shake the frontline officers." The transition from detached observer to committed actor was over. He was no longer a reconnaissance pilot. He was a desperate man with a single crucial piece of intelligence that could save thousands of lives. The next step was to convince the highest levels of command that a blur on a photograph was worth launching a clandestine operation that could cost his own. The atmosphere in the headquarters briefing room was glacial. Generals and air marshals, men who commanded armies and air fleets, listened with ill-concealed impatience as Flight Lieutenant Vance presented his theory. The contrast was stark. The clean-uniformed, unscarred photopilot versus the battle-hardened strategists who saw only risk and deviation in his narrative. "So, Flight Lieutenant," asked General Hastings, his voice a gravelly rumble of skepticism, "you are asking us to divert resources, special forces, air cover, based on a shadow in a photograph and an assumption about a captured SOE agent we had already written off. Do you understand the scale of the operation you are suggesting?" Vance took a deep breath. His training had taught him to rely on facts, not sentiment. He knew his only leverage was the precise technological truth embedded in the evidence. This was not a plea for a humanitarian mission, it was a strategic imperative. "General, the nature of the Geheimfeldpolizei transport indicates a counterintelligence priority, not a standard POW transfer. Furthermore, Agent Kestrel, Elara Dubois, was operating in the communications sector of Army Group B. Her last known contact mentioned an unusual concentration of Panzer Reserve divisions, movements that contradict standard defensive positions. She believed the Germans were preparing a large-scale concealed strike, a Wacht am Rhein operation, something massive and entirely unexpected. The mention of a large-scale offensive, a possible strategic reversal, caused a ripple of unease. The Allied leadership was focused on the quick push to the Rhine. They did not want to believe the enemy could still mount a devastating counterblow. This was the core of the historical resistance, the inability to imagine the enemy's desperate capability. Vance shifted his presentation, focusing not on Kestrel, but on the technology of the German preparation. He showed a series of older reconnaissance shots taken by other pilots, overlaid with his own data. He pointed out the subtly expanded rail lines in secluded forest areas, the stockpiling of winter fuel in remote villages, and the sudden, suspicious lack of German communication traffic in a key sector, a sign of radio silence enforced for a massive troop concentration. The motorcade I photographed was moving in the one direction that would take Agent Kestrel away from any friendly lines, towards a deep-cover Gestapo holding cell in the German heartland, Vance argued, his voice gaining authority. They are not trying to interrogate her further. They are eliminating her and her intelligence before they strike. If they are willing to risk an armed convoy for one prisoner, that prisoner must hold the key to the entire operation. The strategic weight of his argument finally began to penetrate the room's skepticism. The idea of a massive, hidden German counteroffensive, later to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, was a terrifying possibility. If Kestrel had the dates, the objectives, and the main thrust points, she was a walking battle plan. A high-ranking SOE liaison, Colonel Davies, a man who dealt in the shadows of intelligence, spoke up. Vance's analysis of Agent Kestrel's character is sound. She would never break under standard interrogation. If they are moving her for termination, it means they know she holds the precise, actionable intelligence they cannot risk falling into our hands. The risk-reward ratio is too high for them to simply execute her without strategic purpose. The decision was agonizingly slow. Launching a high-risk extraction mission deep behind enemy lines was a massive gamble. The cost of failure was high. Lost men, lost planes, and a catastrophic security leak. But the cost of inaction was potentially higher. A complete surprise attack that could splinter the Allied front. Finally, General Hastings conceded, his face grim. "All right, Flight Lieutenant. You have convinced us there is a non-zero probability of a crisis. We cannot risk a total strategic surprise. But this is not a general's operation. This is a surgical strike. It requires surgical precision. You found her. You know the terrain. You will lead the mission planning." This was the next stage of Vance's transformation, from pilot to planner, from observer to participant. The quiet man who valued distance was now forced to design a close-quarters, desperate extraction. The mission was codenamed Operation Kestrel's Drop. Vance immediately immersed himself in the dark arts of clandestine operations. He worked with a small elite team of SAS commandos, men who lived and breathed silent warfare. The technological details were paramount: custom-rigged Douglas C-47 transport planes, specialized radio beacons designed to mimic German frequencies, and the critical pathfinding, Vance's own photographic plates, now serving as the mission's maps. The team needed to insert, locate the prisoner, and extract her in less than 6 hours, the estimated travel time to the permanent holding facility. The plan was a testament to the urgency. Vance would pilot the lead C-47, using his reconnaissance skills to navigate a low-altitude route below German radar coverage, a suicide run through the heavily defended valleys of the contested zone. The quiet pilot was about to fly the loudest, most dangerous mission of his career, all for the sake of a falling figure he'd seen for 15 seconds. The irony was profound. The technical perfectionist was now relying on a monumental human gamble. The plan for Operation Kestrel's Drop was a masterpiece of military improvisation, a high-stakes bet where technological superiority was married to absolute stealth. It required an inversion of normal tactical procedure. Instead of using overwhelming force, they were relying on invisibility and the element of psychological surprise. The narrative now shifts to the meticulous preparation, where the scale of industrial commitment to special warfare is laid bare. The core of the operation was the transport. 2 stripped-down C-47 Skytrains, codenamed Spectre 1 and Spectre 2. These aircraft, usually symbols of Allied industrial might, ferrying thousands of tons of supplies daily, were now operating in the shadows. To evade the formidable German radar and flak networks, Vance utilized a recently developed top-secret navigation technique, terrain following, at extreme low altitude. This involved flying literally just above the treetops, using a combination of his own photo-reconnaissance strip maps and a primitive ground-mapping radar unit borrowed from a prototype night fighter. The training was intense and short. Vance, the solo pilot, was paired with a team of 6 SAS operators led by Major Grizzly Thorne, a man whose silence was heavier than Vance's, a silence born of action, not observation. Thorne's perspective was crucial. "We don't do heroics, Flight Lieutenant. We do the job. The enemy expects noise, they expect a front. We're going to give them a shadow." The gear was specialized, highlighting the technological disparity that was slowly crippling the Axis. The SAS men carried silenced Sten submachine guns and custom-machined fighting knives. Their communication relied on a new, compact, high-frequency burst transmitter capable of sending a 3-second intelligence report in a single, unjammable blast of static, a technological edge the Germans simply did not possess. The strategic statistics of the operation were brutal. Risk assessment, 85% probability of failure, defined as loss of the aircraft or capture of the team. Fuel margin, 10 minutes of reserve fuel for the entire round trip. Intelligence window, less than 72 hours until the estimated start of the German counter-offensive. Vance spent hours analyzing the latest prints. The location of the motorcade's eventual destination, a temporary detention bunker near a communications relay station. He noted the placement of a single German MG-42 machine gun nest overlooking the main approach road, the height of the perimeter fence, and the precise angle of the limited searchlights. His eye for technical detail transformed the grainy images into a three-dimensional model of the enemy's defenses. He also had to manage the psychological dimension of the mission. The German officers holding Agent Kestrel were not standard jailers. They were intelligence professionals. They would be paranoid, expecting a rescue attempt once Kestrel's absence from the main facility was noted. The internal monologue of a German officer, Major Klaus Richter, responsible for Kestrel's final disposition, provides a chilling counterpoint. Richter was a man of meticulous order, a true believer in the Reich's technological superiority. In a historically based internal memo, he writes, "The Allies rely on the crude hammer blow. They do not possess the finesse for a deep penetration, especially at night. Agent Kestrel will be processed before any such attempt can be made. Our position is secure. They cannot see us. They cannot hear us." This historical irony, the confidence in their own security apparatus, was the very crack that Vance intended to exploit. The departure was scheduled for the dead of night. As Vance strapped himself into the cold cockpit of Spectre 1, the full weight of the mission settled upon him. He was trading the technical elegance of high-altitude reconnaissance for the brutal chaos of a nighttime parachute drop. His psychological state, usually one of detached observation, was now focused on a single imperative: the woman he saw fall. He saw her not as Agent Kestrel, the asset, but as the exhausted, struggling human who defied the brutal logic of her captors. That singular act of human defiance had broken Vance's own detachment. Before takeoff, Major Thorne looked at Vance, his eyes hard and steady. "We get in fast. We get her out. If we run into trouble, your job is to fly out the extraction plane. You don't engage. You fly." Vance nodded. He knew the command was absolute, but he also knew the difference between a mission plan and the reality of human survival. The stage was set, a handful of men against an industrial empire, betting on the value of a secret held by a single, exhausted woman. The hum of the C-47 engine started, a deep rumble that seemed to chew up the night sky. The adventure was about to begin, and it depended entirely on the pilot's ability to turn a flat, two-dimensional photograph into a path to salvation. If the cold reality of wartime strategy and the silent bravery of those who risked everything to change history captivates you, take a moment to subscribe. We dive deep into the untold stories and technical secrets of the Second World War every week. Now, back to the fight. The flight into enemy territory was a masterpiece of nerve and navigation. Vance kept Spectre 1 at an impossibly low altitude, the prop tips churning the air just above the dark canopy of the forest. The air was a constant whip of turbulence, and every second felt like a reckless flirtation with catastrophe. The sensory details were overwhelming. The smell of hot oil and the freezing metal of the fuselage, the violent jolts, and the constant, deafening roar of the engines just feet from the ground. Below them, the landscape of war was strangely quiet. The German front line, usually a maze of searchlights and tracer fire, was subdued, a consequence of the strategic deception required for their own upcoming offensive. This enforced quiet was the tactical opportunity Vance was banking on. The drop zone was a small, pre-identified clearing about 2 miles from the temporary detention bunker. Vance hit the target with perfect, almost impossible precision. The SAS team, led by Major Thorne, slipped out of the C-47's belly and into the blackness, the entire deployment taking less than 40 seconds. Spectre 1 immediately banked hard, climbing slightly to set up a slow, orbiting holding pattern, a lifeline for the extraction. Thorne's team moved like phantoms through the dense woods. The psychological tension was immense. They were surrounded by thousands of enemy soldiers, yet their entire existence depended on moving without disturbing a single leaf. The technical focus here was on stealth gear, minimal metal, darkened equipment, and specialized footwear that minimized sound on the wet, frozen ground. The narrative splits, following the SS team's perspective. Their mission was one of pure sensory deprivation, relying on non-visual cues. Thorne relied on the damp smell of coal smoke to locate the compound, and the subtle crunch of a German sentry's boot on the gravel path to time his approach. The German perspective, meanwhile, centered on Major Richter and his security detail. Richter, having transferred Kestrel to the temporary bunker, was awaiting final orders. His fear was not a frontal attack, but an internal breach or a sudden change in command structure. The enemy's internal suspicion was as strong as the Allied external threat. Inside the bunker, Agent Kestrel, Elara Dubois, was suffering the final stages of interrogation. She had resisted physical torture, but the Germans were using a more insidious psychological warfare, depriving her of sleep and feeding her false information about Allied defeats. Yet, she held firm. The strategic knowledge she carried was a physical weight, a secret weapon that she knew could turn the tide. She had mentally charted the entire German offensive, the code names, the assembly areas, the sheer number of divisions committed. She was determined that this information would die with her, or somehow, against all odds, escape. Suddenly, outside the bunker, the night broke, not with a shout or a gunshot, but with a choked, unnatural silence. The crunch of a sentry's boot stopped mid-step, a muffled thud. Thorne's team had breached the perimeter fence with wire cutters and taken down the first two sentries with silent efficiency. They approached the bunker. Vance's reconnaissance had been flawless. The main entrance was guarded by two men. The rear exit, used for disposing of waste, was unlocked and only secured by a bolt. Thorne signaled the breach. The subsequent minutes were a blur of calculated violence. They entered through the rear, clearing the two inner rooms with terrifying speed. The fight was not a grand battle. It was a succession of precise, brutal moments. Sten guns spit their muffled rounds. German guards, startled from their complacency, found themselves facing trained assassins appearing from the darkness they had trusted. The technological advantage of the suppressed weapon was decisive. The noise was contained, the alarm not raised. Thorne reached Kestrel's cell. He found her chained to a cot, barely conscious, but her eyes snapped open with a desperate, lucid intelligence. "We are SAS, Agent Kestrel," Thorne whispered. "Time to go." Kestrel's first words were not a cry of relief, but a question of strategy. "The attack. It begins in the north sector. The password is Barbarossa. Tell them north, north, north." That was the twist. The Allied command was expecting a central thrust. Kestrel's intelligence pointed to a decisive, unexpected movement far to the north, a flank maneuver that could have been catastrophic. The risk taken by Vance and the command had paid off. The human asset had delivered the game-changing intelligence. The extraction was now a race against time and sound. They had alerted the immediate guards, and the alarm would soon spread. The silent hunt was over. The desperate dash for the skies was about to begin. Vance, orbiting high above, felt the Spitfire tremble in the turbulent air, knowing that any second, a coded burst of radio signal would determine whether he was bringing home a strategic asset or just a team of ghosts. The frontline officers were about to learn that a single sight, seen from 25,000 feet, could unravel their entire strategic comfort zone. The race out of the bunker was a frantic reversal of the silent infiltration. The SAS team, now burdened with the exhausted Agent Kestrel, fought a running retreat through the surrounding woods. Kestrel, despite her condition, showed extraordinary resilience, moving under her own power, fueled by the knowledge she had to deliver. Major Thorne sent the prearranged signal, a short, 3-second burst on the high-frequency transmitter. Spectre 1 immediately received the coded message. "Kestrel secure. Proceed to alternate LZ." Vance swung the C-47's nose towards the new pre-planned landing zone, LZ, a makeshift strip near a frozen river bend. This was the moment where the strategic gamble either paid off or cost them everything. The The German counter-reaction was already gathering momentum. Searchlights began to rake the sky from distant towns, and the deep throbbing sound of heavy engine mobilization, tanks and trucks, was becoming audible even in the cockpit of the C-47. The technical accuracy of Vance's original reconnaissance was now the team's only shield. He had noted the precise location of a minor German anti-aircraft battery. He guided the C-47 on a winding, circuitous route that used the topographical features, the ridgelines, the deeper valleys, to shield the aircraft from immediate detection. Down on the ground, the extraction was precarious. Thorne's team reached the river bend, setting up a perimeter. They deployed a low-power, coded beacon that only Vance's specialized navigation equipment could home in on. This was a critical piece of technology, a microtransmitter that was almost impossible to triangulate by the enemy, yet provided Vance with a precise digital vector to the landing strip. Vance brought Spectre 1 down in a hair-raising short-field landing, kicking up a blizzard of ice and snow. The C-47, usually requiring miles of runway, stopped inches from the frozen riverbank. The roar of the engines was a terrifying alarm bell in the silent night. The German response was now fully galvanized. Major Richter, finally aware of the security breach and the identity of the escaped prisoner, mobilized everything he had. The chase became an immediate, desperate pursuit. His internal terror was palpable. A high-value prisoner, holding the secrets of the Führer's last great gamble, was escaping under his nose. If they succeed, Richter thought, an internal monologue reflecting the Axis's paranoia, the entire Watch on the Rhine will be compromised. The cost to the Reich will be unimaginable. This is not just a prisoner. This is the plan itself. As Kestrel was rushed aboard the C-47, the perimeter was engaged. German patrols, drawn by the engine noise, opened fire. The SAS team returned a controlled, heavy fire, the tracer rounds lighting up the frozen landscape in violent, scarlet arcs. The sounds were sensory, visceral. The crack of rifles, the heavier thump of the German MG-42, and the metallic clatter as rounds perforated the C-47's thin aluminum skin. The final critical decision rested with Vance. He was still the pilot, not the soldier. But as the last SAS man tumbled aboard, Thorne gave him the signal. "Go! Go! Go!" Vance shoved the throttles forward. The C-47 lumbered down the makeshift strip, struggling for lift. The plane was hit multiple times, the control surfaces shuddering, but they cleared the trees, climbing into the relative safety of the low cloud cover. The escape was successful. Hours later, Agent Kestrel, safely back at Allied headquarters, provided the full, chilling details. The German plan was not a localized counterattack, but a massive, synchronized armored thrust through the lightly defended Ardennes, the exact sector where Vance had seen the convoy. She provided the date, the main axis of attack, and the operational objectives. The sheer scale was confirmed by the statistics: 25 German divisions, including 10 armored or mechanized, poised for a knockout blow. The reveal was a cataclysmic shock. It was a strategic bomb dropped on the Allied command structure. The frontline officers, who had been complacent in their assumed superiority, were instantly galvanized into a panicked frenzy. The quiet pilot's instinct, based on a single image of human distress, had yielded the most critical intelligence of the entire European campaign. Alistair Vance had not just saved a person, he had given the Allies the priceless gift of foresight. The transformation was complete. The reconnaissance pilot had become the catalyst for the defense of the Western Front. His quiet, unorthodox action had fundamentally altered the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge before the first German shell was even fired. The immediate aftermath of Operation Kestrel's drop was a period of near-hysterical strategic repositioning, now known historically as the Vance-Kestrel window. The intelligence gathered by Agent Kestrel, confirming the exact axis of the German counteroffensive, the Ardennes, forced a massive, immediate shift in Allied deployment. This was the moment where the quiet pilot's action truly shook the frontline officers. The statistical scale of the response was staggering. In the 72 hours following Kestrel's debriefing, 1. Troop deployment. 2 full U.S. infantry divisions and 1 armored division were rushed into the critical choke points of the Ardennes, specifically to Bastogne and the northern shoulders of the attack. 2. Air superiority. All available Allied fighter-bomber groups were put on maximum alert, stockpiling ordnance and fuel, ready to exploit the first break in the winter weather. A crucial preemptive measure that would minimize the German advantage. 3. Industrial logistics. Hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and supplies were diverted from offensive operations toward the suddenly defensive, thin-stretched front. The entire European logistical infrastructure was twisted and reformed based on a single, unconventional source. The initial skepticism was replaced by a grim, professional determination. The generals realized the profound historical irony. Their entire command structure had been saved from catastrophic surprise by the methodical eye of a reconnaissance pilot and the sheer willpower of a captured spy. When the German offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, finally exploded on December 16th, the Allies were still surprised by the sheer ferocity, but they were no longer unprepared. The forces rushed into Bastogne, specifically the 101st Airborne Division, were in position only because Kestrel's intelligence had prioritized the area. The famous, brutal standoff that followed was not a miracle. It was a strategically enabled defense. The narrative pivots to the psychological impact on the German side. Major Richter, the officer who lost Kestrel, faced a rapid, terrifying inquiry. His internal memo, later recovered, details the professional terror. The plan is compromised. They expected us. The resistance at Elsenborn Ridge and St. Vith is too organized. We have lost the element of complete surprise. One woman, one mistake on a forest road. The Reich will pay for this lapse in security. The German confidence, rooted in technological and operational secrecy, was shattered by the human element. Vance, the architect of the success, was immediately pulled back from the front line. The secrecy surrounding Operation Kestrel's drop was absolute. The source of the intelligence could not be compromised, even to the soldiers on the front line who were now benefiting from the warning. His heroism was silent and immediately classified. He returned to his Spitfire, flying increasingly dangerous missions, but his perspective was forever changed. His arc of transformation was complete. He had proven that the human element, instinct, observation, and moral courage, was often more powerful than the largest armies and the most sophisticated technology. The technical precision of the Spitfire's camera had simply been the delivery mechanism for a moment of human empathy. The narrative must emphasize the sheer scale of the historical impact. Without Kestrel's intelligence, the German forces would have likely penetrated deep into the Allied rear, seizing the vital port of Antwerp, isolating entire armies, and potentially dragging the war on for another 6 to 12 brutal months. The legacy of the quiet pilot was not medals or headlines, but the uncountable, silent statistic of lives saved. The thousands of soldiers whose positions were fortified, the hundreds of tanks that were pre-staged, the millions of gallons of fuel that did not fall into enemy hands. Vance saved the strategic balance of the Western Front, all because he saw a woman fall and chose to believe the anomaly over the routine. The climax of the story is the moment the Allied troops held their line against the Bulge, a defense made possible by a piece of paper handed over in a cold briefing room, itself the result of a photographic plate analyzed by a quiet pilot. The irony of the war was that its grand movements often hinged on its smallest, most overlooked details. The war ended, but the story of Agent Kestrel's drop was officially buried under layers of Allied counterintelligence classifications. Alistair Vance, the pilot who saved the Bulge, received only a minor commendation for exceptional airmanship and returned to a quiet civilian life, becoming a cartographer, a fitting end for a man obsessed with reading the land. Agent Kestrel, Elara Dubois, vanished into the anonymity of the post-war intelligence community, her real contribution too sensitive to ever be publicly acknowledged. This final act explores the long shadow of the event and its eventual partial reveal. The legacy of the operation lay in the military doctrine that emerged, a new emphasis on the human technical interface, recognizing that no machine, no matter how advanced, could replace the intuitive leap of a trained human observer. The quiet pilot had permanently changed the way military intelligence valued the anomalous observation. Historians, years later, would puzzle over the incredible resilience of the Allied defense in the Ardennes, often attributing it solely to the tenacity of the troops and the sheer industrial power of the US war machine. The full truth, the 15 seconds that changed the war, remained a whispered secret among a handful of intelligence officers. The enduring psychological impact was significant. For Vance, the detached observer was gone forever. He had peered into the chaotic heart of human conflict and chosen involvement. The silence of his peacetime life was often punctuated by the vivid memory of the forest road, the falling figure, and the deafening roar of the C-47 lifting away from the German pursuit. The documentary's final reflection circles back to the core theme, the human cost and the moral imperative. The scale of the war demanded massive industrial solutions, but it was individual courage, quiet and often unrecorded, that truly determined its course. The technology, the Spitfire PR-19, the high-frequency radio burst, the specialized camera lenses, were merely tools. The engine of change was the man who chose to risk everything to act on a hunch. The historical truth is that the biggest twists in the grand narrative of Y2 were often set in motion by the smallest, most secret adventures. The quiet British pilot who saw a female POW fall did not just save her life. He gave the Allies the few critical hours they needed to prepare, turning a near catastrophe into the decisive victory that ultimately hastened the end of the conflict in Europe. The story of the falling figure, of the quiet pilot, and of the secret that shook the frontline officers is not just a tale of technology and strategy. It is a testament to the enduring power of human vigilance and the simple, world-altering fact that sometimes the most profound acts of courage are conducted in absolute silence, 25,000 feet above the chaos. His story, and the thousands of lives it saved, is the ultimate unwritten truth of the European war. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of the most classified and vital intelligence missions of World War II. If you want more stories of strategic brilliance, technological secrets, and the untold human drama that determined the fate of nations, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these meticulously researched historical documentaries to light. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us next time as we explore another forgotten chapter of history.